board members. Okay, and recording is in progress if you didn't hear that. And we are joined by some Gold Standard Arts Foundation board members. So if those folks just want to give a wave, I'm so happy to see them in the room as well. There we go. Okay, so Phil, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Hi, guys. Nice to be with you. This really came out of the work of Final Bow for Yellowface, which was aimed at improving Asian representation in the performing arts. And after the shooting in Atlanta, it just felt like the whole dance community was coming in to say, okay, what's the action item? What's the hashtag? How do we take action? And it just made me and my co-founder, Georgina Pascogan of Final Bow, we realized that we needed a larger network to support Asian creatives in dance. And so that was the start of the Gold Standard Arts Foundation. We're doing programs like this. We have a robust membership program. So those of you who aren't members, we'd love to have you. We're looking at, we have a survey that looks at the AAPI experience to build programs to address pipeline issues. We're looking to partner with institutions to hopefully build more programs that give opportunities to AAPI creatives for networking. Our next event is actually Saturday, August 9th. It's a community tea house hosted by Jessica Tong, who's on our call, one of our board members. And it's a chance for the community to get together, share what they're working on, as well as network with other folks. So it's a chance for us to build more meaningful community that's focused on other AAPI creatives. So it's just a pleasure always being in these rooms. I know every time I come into these rooms, I was like, wow, it was just a room full of Asian people and we didn't have to explain. We all started in this like base level of understanding, which is always just refreshing, especially when the world can be so messy for folks sometimes. So just really nice to be holding space with everybody today. And yeah, please get involved with Gold Standard if you like today's programming, if you'd like to contribute to the community. We're looking for other volunteers, for donors, for other members, just for folks who want to help build a more meaningful AAPI dance creative community. So welcome and thank you, Kay, for taking the time, and Sarah for moderating this session. And I personally have a lot of questions. I'm very excited about this session because I know my very Chinese father is always breathing down my neck about being an artist and not making enough money. So really looking forward to this. So thank you, Kay. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So before we dive in, I wanted to introduce Kay Takeda. And I'm first of all so excited that she could join us for this program, be a part of our inaugural series of programming, and host this workshop, because I truly look up to her as a person in the field who is doing the work is the way. And I see her at so many performances, and she's always out and about seeing shows, being present with artists and artistic practice. So the fact that we are getting a workshop about the financial lives of artists from someone who has worked in programming, someone has worked in grant making, and different aspects of the art world, I think is very special. And then on top of that, even more specifically, the Asian American artist community coming together to talk about this topic. So I do want to say and share, if you haven't read her bio, that Kay Takeda has worked for over 25 years to support the advancements of artists in the arts sector. Currently, she is executive director of the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, an organization uniquely founded and led by Artists for Artists. And if you don't know about FCA, I highly recommend you checking out their work, because I think they're doing wonderful things. And then previously, she developed strategy and oversaw a roster of artist-focused initiatives at the Joan Mitchell Foundation, including the launch of the multi-year Joan Mitchell Fellowship. In prior roles, Takeda expanded local grant-making, community partnerships, and professional development programs at Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. She led national grant-making programs at Arts International, and managed exhibitions and programming at the Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art, Snug Harbor. She serves on the board of Movement Research, dance, and frequently sits on funding panels and lectures widely on professional issues affecting artists. So I wanted to take the time to read her bio so you can learn a little bit more about her and the different vantage points that she's bringing in and the different experiences. Okay, and without further ado, I'm super excited and happy to pass it over to Kay.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate it, and will maybe cut down on my own remarks a bit. But I do want to say this is like a great room. I almost like the topic financial lives of artists. I almost would rather sit here and ask you all about the financial lives of artists. So I do hope that this will be a dialogue, and please feel free to chime in with your own experiences or questions or things that people want to talk about along the way. I think I did want to say a couple of things. One thing that about FCA before I start. I've been executive director of the organization for about a year and a half. And of course, as Sarah noted, it's an organization that was founded by artists for artists 60 years ago. So it's our 60th anniversary this year. And it was founded by Jasper Johns when he was 33 years old, along with John Cage. And what they did was put together a benefit exhibition to support Merce Cunningham's first Broadway show, which ended up not happening because of a strike. And instead, he made an international tour that was so kind of important to introduce his work internationally and back to the United States. But what that really came out of was a recognition by a number of visual artists at the time that their peers in the performing arts didn't have the same means to sort of sell work to generate the funds. And it was so hard to access funds to create work. And so it really was this beautiful act of solidarity among artists that generated this organization that's been around for decades now and still continues to hold benefit exhibitions where donated work is sold to support our grant making programs. And of course, we've grown a lot since then, and we're very fortunate to have a number of supporters and institutions that helped move the work forward. But I really do want to make sure that everyone's aware of the organization. There are two core grant programs that we offer. One is our unrestricted grants to artists program, and that is really an opportunity for us to recognize artists with unrestricted support just for the incredible contributions that they're making to the field. We focus on experimental and contemporary work in particular. Today we fund across dance, music, sound, theater, performance art, poetry, and visual arts. And those grants are $45,000 a year that are awarded by nomination and a sort of confidential research process. So the artists don't find out that they've received they don't have to apply. They just find out they received the award with a phone call, which is always the highlight of our year. And our emergency grants program, which offers grants of up to $3,000 to support urgent last minute needs that come up in the few months leading up to a confirmed engagement or an opportunity to present work. And so that might be, we've actually supported a lot of changes in budgets because of inflation, travel costs that couldn't be covered by a venue, for example, a lot of COVID related last minute personnel replacement, things like that. These are reasons to come to our program. And also if you have a last minute invitation that doesn't allow enough time for fundraising, we see those too, and we fund those as well. So again, they're modest grants, but we have a rolling schedule and we award grants on a monthly basis there. So two things to keep in mind about FCA. In terms of why I'm here talking with you about money, grant making, I didn't set out to sort of be the finance lady in the arts field. A lot of people look at me and think of me as the finance lady. So I just want to acknowledge that. But I've been in grant making for, since 2000. And grant making really gives you a front seat to an enormous amount of financial material information on individual artists and organizations alike. And I just wanted to round out the bio a little bit and say that during my years at LMCC in particular, I was there for 13 years. That was when I started developing professional development workshops for artists to really initially help them access the grants that we were offering. And then that just sort of grew over time and led to the development of a 6-week personal finance program for artists that we ran for 10 years. And was really an extraordinary opportunity to have these really necessary conversations with artists about the many aspects of personal finance and how that intersects with the professional life. So a lot of the things that I talk about really come out of that work. And, you know, I haven't been directly focused on that work for a number of years now, but I continue to do these talks in part because there aren't a lot of other people doing them. I get a lot of, you know, people invite me to do talks and then they, you know, I don't have a lot of other people to refer in this area. And so I also encourage those of you who come to this talk with maybe a lot of experience and ideas and thoughts to share that you too can be a resource to artists in your community around these conversations and to generate more conversations among artists, because I think it's so critical. And those opportunities are really few and far between. One other thing I should say is I think the most, what the unit I've done most often is to talk about budgeting, you know, project budgeting and personal budgeting. And that talk is actually available online with creativestudy.com. That also has a wonderful curriculum with a number of speakers on personal finance subjects, and they're terrific. So I would just highly recommend them to you if you want anyone who wants to dive into a level of detail that we may not be able to get to today, of course, with an hour and a half. So I always like to lead with, you know, acknowledging how complex artists' finances are. And on the one hand, I feel like I don't need to tell you that, but I think it's useful to acknowledge it and set some frameworks around these kinds of conversations and thinking about artists and money. You know, there's a lot of there's a kind of reputation and I think a myth that artists are not good with money. I think they're very good with money, but they have very complicated lives and complicated streams of income that they have to juggle. And so sometimes that's just overwhelming. And there's a lot of different sets of information that people need to be able to understand and navigate in this circumstance. And the core thing I like to acknowledge is that, you know, artists are navigating two financial systems at the same time, often a for-profit world and a not-for-profit world. And the language and the framing around those two worlds can be very, very different. And so knowing the vocabulary or being able to sort of speak to in that language or in the framework of those worlds can be incredibly important, but no one really talks about that. So, you know, if you think about an application to a grant program for a grant, that's not all that different from a business plan, but they just feel like such different things. And sometimes and the vocabulary and the ethos around those things are very different. So, you know, I remember we had once an artist who had had developed a business plan for a project, and they'd submitted that in an organization I was involved in an adjudication process for. They'd submitted that, a version of that as their grant application. And everyone was very upset by the language because it was more of this sort of business forward, you know, it felt commercial and too businessy. And at the same time, this wasn't an artist who was looking to work in a purely commercial sense. It really felt to me like they had access to a certain amount of useful information that helped them develop a business plan for what they were doing. And it was being taken in a very different way because of the vocabulary and the framing. So that's just something I like to say, because a lot of people encourage artists to go towards business resources. And sometimes that is also alienating because the vocabulary feels really different and opaque. But artists are already doing a lot of this kind of work. That artists are developing budgets, they're putting proposals forward for work that they want to do. It's just called something different, and it's just framed in sort of the language of sort of public service, public good, and charitable purpose. So I just think that that's nonetheless, those are the worlds that people seem to be operating in. And I think if we don't acknowledge that, there's just sometimes there are a lot of pitfalls around focusing on one or the other, or encouraging artists to look at resources in one or other space without recognizing those differences. I also think it's useful to point to the complexity of artists in performance, especially, or, you know, often self-producing their work or co-producing their work, and sometimes doing those things at the same time. and just meaning that sometimes you're responsible for everything, right? For raising the money, for getting the work up on stage, for getting the audience there. And sometimes you're working with an institution, and that should feel sometimes like it's easier. And then it's not, because it still involves a lot of negotiation and coordination, and having a partner that will do some of the producing and the support, and you still are doing your part. It's not a simple proposition. So I think that's always a good thing to keep in mind. And then the other thing that I think about a lot is that artists are often situated at the end of a trickle down presenting economy. And of course, this became very apparent in the pandemic. I use donuts here in lieu of money in my diagram. But, it's sort of, if you think about where there's funding coming from venue funders, donors, audience to a venue, and then some of that money is devoted to the artist fee, sometimes a commission. And then for the artist, there's also other income streams that, they're needing to keep track of. And that income that's coming from the venue is just one small part of a very complex project. So again, all of you know this, you've been doing this work and you know it firsthand. But I think that it's being able to frame that for other people sometimes is really helpful, because there's kind of a gloss over that happens where people don't sort of recognize the level of complexity that people are dealing with. Are there any thoughts on that anyone wants to kind of share or reflect on before we? I realize that I can't see everybody, so.
I was just looking at this, and it's interesting how, like, in this trickle down presenting economy, there's a focus on the products. Like, the point of sale would be like a ticket to see the performance. But what I found in the pandemic, some presenters and just folks within the arts community coming together and being like, okay, we can't always think about like an end point of performance as at the time of making money, but like, how can we think about how artists need to have money throughout the artistic process, and like building that into contracts. So I think that I've seen a change there.
That's great to hear.
And Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just an observation, I guess.
Yeah.
The artist being at the end of the trickle down, of course, feels very real and true to me. But it makes me wonder if a couple of the reasons are, one, that artists fit in the least obviously to most economic models, because for-profit, nonprofit, as you pointed out, but also in just our process and our way of relating to various sectors of society is just not standard at all. And secondly, the taking for granted ness of what we do, because there's a of those other factors, there's also a lack of familiarity, and I think a distance between artists and many others, the way other sectors of society function, and that so it's a taking for granted / invisibilization, I think, and that all the negative stuff.
Absolutely. All of the time and the preparation and all of that is sort of invisible, because there's this emphasis of like the event is happening, or everyone's the performances are what everyone experiences, but the sometimes many years of work and preparation are not at all understood. There's also it's that kind of last in, first out situation with the contracting with venues and when things go wrong and when budget cuts happen. I mean, in our emergency grants, we see a lot of proposals from artists who get phone calls within, you know, a couple months of their engagement, learning that the budget is not going to be there at the level that they were communicated about earlier on in the process. And that to me is like a very, that's a very big red flag. And a lot of conversations that come up about that's the sort of reliability of resource over time. And of course, a lot of this is happening also to venues that struggle to raise funds themselves. But I think there's a, you know, at the end of the line, if the artist is doing that performance, they also have the reputational weight of that sort of lack of resources is really felt too. I like to show these slides too, because of course, you know, this is just one example of a pie chart of sort of the kinds of revenues that artists might bring in to keep their practice, sort of to sustain it over time. The relationship of something that may be another, like a stable ongoing source of income, like teaching or a day job structure, as well as things like, you know, sales and commissions and fees that are being received, grants, fellowships, and donors over time. There's a lot of conversation, of course, of the importance of diversified revenues for practices and for projects. And I think a lot of artists are really doing that, juggling that in a very sometimes precarious way. And it's complex to make that also visible. I think everyone's familiar with also artist projects where the diversified revenues may come from similar kinds of resources to support a project. In talking about budgeting and also like artist support, there's of course this relationship between projects and sort of the personal finances of an artist. And I always like to talk about the importance of, you know, the goal of the revenues from projects going towards the work, but also contributing to an artist's livelihood in the form of a fee. And so, of course, that comes up very frequently in conversations about finances, is how artists are paying themselves, how they are being paid by others, and how they're paying others. And maybe that's a good segue into a conversation about a budget. I was not going to share an example of a budget, and then I found myself like constitutionally unable to do that. So there are 2 slides of budgets here, but that I will show. But I think the point here is really just to talk more broadly about the value of budgets for as a planning tool, but also as a communication tool. Is everybody here really comfortable with budgeting? Is there anyone who hasn't done a lot of work around budgets with their projects in the past? I guess people's screens, like I see a few hands. Okay, great. I like to say this because, you know, not knowing how many people in the audience are really familiar with budgeting, but I think there's always at least one person who hasn't actually used a spreadsheet very much before and doesn't know that a spreadsheet like does the math for you. So I just like to say that, you know, budget is a really wonderful tool to keep track of the work that you need to do. A budget is really just a plan. It's a plan for it's a financial plan for whatever it is you're planning to do. And it's a way to track the money that you hope will come in and the money that you expect to go out. And then a way to compare your plans to what actually happens over time, and a way to adjust your plans as your actual expenses and income come in. And because it's a plan that really, of course, necessarily changes over time, it's not a static item, but it really, I think, needs to work for an artist. And I think there are a lot of questions. I get a lot of questions about what a budget should look like. And I think that has to do with the communication piece of a budget when you're sending it out into the world and you need to communicate others about what you're doing. But I always like to emphasize that first and foremost, the budget has to work for you as a planning tool. So you might want to have a version that is really the one that has all the notes and all the details in it, that allows you to keep track of what's coming in and what is going out. But that being said, a budget is an extremely useful communication tool. Part of the reason it's required in a lot of application contexts for funding. People who are, of course, very fluent with budgeting can sometimes look at the budget first and glean a lot from it, a lot more information from it, perhaps, than they might glean from a narrative description of a project. So it's really important that it convey and align with what it is that you are putting out into the world in a narrative form as well. I think that some of the things that a budget really can communicate very quickly to someone is the feasibility of any endeavor. And that is, how it reflects the experience that you may have doing the work that you've done before, because if you've done it before, because people will notice that the amounts that are in the budget are actually clear and appropriate, and that can actually shine through. They also communicate if you have your plans in place, because there are certain things that you may not talk about in your narrative, but will show up in a budget. For example, if you have plans about communications and marketing and how you're going to bring audiences to the work, sometimes that doesn't, if that's not in a budget, that can say a lot. And if it is in a budget, it also is very encouraging. Helps give a sense of your networks if you're able to, if depending on the level of detail you include, who's involved in your project, or the kinds of professionals that you're bringing in to work with you. It can also reflect your sort of awareness of professionalism or best practices, and your values. And that, of course, I speak from a sort of funding setting where I see a lot of budgets, and there are a lot of discussions of artist budgets by artists and by other professionals in the field. And those people are always very interested in what people are paying each other, of course. And so I think it speaks volumes there too. And your peers, especially when they're looking at budgets in funding context, are always interested in the level of detail. And so they're wanting to know how much people are being paid, what is the actual breakdown of personnel that are being supported, et cetera, et cetera. And those again, if you're sort of prepared for thinking about like who's your audience with your budget in the same way as you would with a narrative, then it can really be an incredibly supportive communication tool as well. The other thing I like to note is that budgets have a role to play for projects, but also for life. And I like to use actually a personal experience here. When I first started using a budget for my own life, because I had been working actually in funding for a period of time and managing a lot of, keeping track of a lot of funder money. And where it was going and how it was being used, but not being able to keep track of my own sort of bills and personal debts and commitments. And I realized that I'd been working for years with budgeting tools in my job and not bringing them into my own life. And when I actually did that, it was extraordinarily helpful. So I don't know how many people here actually use an actual budget in their daily life to track their own expenses and plans for things that may or may not relate to their practice. Does anyone here do that? Great.
I have a loose budget, Kay.
Loose is good.
I feel like I'm like you in the past, like, yes, budgets for work, budgets for life, loose. Anyways, back to you.
Right.
Hey,
in general, sorry, go ahead.
Bonnie.
If I might add, I've been teaching business practices as part of career development and the importance of budgets professionally. And then when I finally got a software system to do mine, I realized what my monthly net was. And so it became an interesting vehicle for myself to manage my personal.
That's right. Yes. And it's also so important if you actually using a budget for your personal life, and exactly as you're saying, what's your monthly net? Like, what does your life cost? it can actually help inform how you're thinking about how you're paying yourself, or what kind of artist fee is appropriate or necessary for you to be involved in XYZ endeavor. At least knowing what it is that you need is one of these like critical inputs to be able to determine, oh, should I do this? Does this make sense? Should I ask for more, etc. I think that in project budgeting, that's sort of the number one question, of course, that always comes up in a room, is sort of like, how are people planning and structuring their artist fees? And the answer, I suppose, is always, it depends. I have always I've not answered that question, although I've had artists say to me, like their rule of thumb is a certain percentage of their overall project budget, 20% or less. That's not like, I'm not here to give people advice about what to pay themselves, but what I do think is really useful is to make sure that you're thinking about the relationship of what fees you're asking for, what fees you're receiving in relationship to your personal expenses. And so it's really useful in that regard. And I think the other thing that is really worth saying is that budgets in general are a really great way to externalize financial information from your body and your brain. And that can go a really long way towards a kind of peace of mind and a more and an ability to sort of engage those questions by having it somewhere you can see it and somewhere you can manipulate it. And I think that spreadsheets can be really helpful in that regard, because you can test like what would happen if this amount came in or it didn't. Then you can actually see and plot different scenarios around what you might do. And that's how it becomes a planning tool over time. But having my expenses and income and all of my plans in a budget also kind of just drastically, well, it improved my financial management, and it also made it very clear what my financial situation was, which is helpful, and also just reduced the amount of time I was spending thinking about money in a given month. And that's not true for everyone, because if you're juggling a lot of like contracts, if you don't get just a steady paycheck, it's very, there's a lot of tracking that has to happen. So that's not to say like a budget makes everything easy, but it is an incredibly useful tool in terms of the emotional distance and also the practical planning tool. Because I couldn't resist showing some budget examples, I just am going to do that. But I'll tell you, these are old numbers, and they're also, I never show budgets as an example of how the world should be. Do they reflect budgets I've seen? Yes. Are they supposed to be what people should be paid? No. But I do like to share them because I think that there are certain things that are always useful to point to. So this is an example for educational purposes of a kind of a project budget that has income on the top, expenses on the bottom, underneath, and then the balance or deficit at the bottom in that sort of pinkish colored row. And there are just a couple points that I want to make really quickly that I think are useful to keep in mind. On the income side, often budgets are organized by source. Where's the money coming from? And there are a couple of things that I think come up a lot in discussions of if you're trying to budget for a project and you're trying to raise funds for the project and you don't know where they're going to come from. So there are always question marks in the budget. At the same time, you have to send it out and share it with other people and share your plans with other people. This example has like a very clearly laid out, like, oh, these government funds will come in, these foundation funds will come in. And that's the part that can be complex, because if you have a line item for every single funding source that you hope to bring in, you may be sharing what you're asking for. It doesn't mean that you'll receive it. There's certain things you may be applying for the first time. You don't know if you'll get it. There are certain things you have received in the past, and showing those if you reasonably expect to receive them, that can be really helpful. But one of the suggestions that I make when people are trying to do this is to actually represent the amount of money that you're trying to raise from a source, from say foundations. And then list the various foundations that you're approaching to get to that number. so that you're not kind of stuck with math that doesn't accurately represent what's really going to happen, right? Is that some of that will come, like you're trying to reach a certain number, but the sum of all the requests that you're putting out there isn't going to be a very useful tool for you or for others, because it will overinflate how much money. It will give you a sum that's just too high. It's like 100% kind of probability. So that's one of the things that I think that can be very useful. And then on the expense side, we've talked a little bit about artist fees. One of the things I feel like it's worth saying too is I've seen in panel processes a lot, and this is, well, some of you may do film work as well, but like with the exception of filmmaking, sometimes artists they'll break their fee down into the different roles that they have on a project. And what can happen in a panel setting there is that people start to feel like someone's paying themselves many times, even if the amount is very small. And I've seen that conversation happen so many times and had to sort of try to steer people away from it. It's just a psychological thing. So I always like to suggest to people, if you're showing your artist fee, just show one number. And remember that that's the number that's going into your bank account to support your life costs, your rent, all of those expenses. And that if you don't budget to pay yourself something, then of course, as projects evolve and as costs mount, it becomes less and less likely that there'll be a fee for you at the end of that process. So please make sure that you're doing it at the beginning. It's also one of those things that's actually one of the most common problems that we see in budgets for projects that come into many of the grant making programs I've run, is that artists will not budget a fee for themselves. And I think one of the things that's useful to note and is changing over time, but more and more people say, like, oh, if an artist isn't paying themselves, like, how are they going to get the project done? Right. It's a feasibility question. And it comes up especially for, artists who are doing budgeting for the first time, applying for grants for the first time. They feel like, I'm doing the work benefits me, like the grant would benefit me. It's my project. Should I pay myself? And so if that's at all a question in your mind, the answer is absolutely yes, you should do that. You should pay yourself and pay others. One other thing I think is useful to talk about here in budgeting is budgeting for contingency, which is, of course, the unexpected. And that's the sort of second to last line here, right above the pink line of balance. And in this budget, it's 5% of the total budget. And that's just budgeting for the unexpected, that I always think is a useful thing to do, is like how much change might happen more reasonably in your project over time, and just raising money so that towards making sure that you have that kind of cushion. And then finally, at the bottom of this budget, you'll see in-kind contributions as a separate section. And I like to suggest that people show it, because if somebody's giving you space in kind, or they're donating services in kind to you, and they have a dollar value, you should show it, because they're supporting you. That's money and especially if you did this project again and you didn't have that donated, you might have to pay for it, right? So it's useful to actually be able to track those things from project to project. But I like to really strongly suggest you put it at the bottom in a separate section, so you can itemize it and you can show it, but it's not commingling with your cash, because that creates a risk of it looking like you have more resources than you have from a cash perspective, and that's just that nobody needs that challenge to show up in their budget. You would need to show it in your income and your expense, so it's easier to just pull it out and be able to say, look at this wonderful support that I have, that I don't need to do the math around. Are there any other questions or comments on this kind of structured budget? There's one other budget format that I wanted to bring up for everyone.
Is there a recommended rule of thumb from your perspective for admin expenses, like what percentage of the budget they should take? And understand that it would fluctuate depending on the project, but wondering if you have more insight on that. Because sometimes I feel like artists are like, oh, how much is too much to put in admin? Like, how much is too much to count? Yeah, so I wanted to see what your thoughts on that were.
Well, two things. For an individual that's not an organization, like generally I think of admin as like an admin percentage is for an organization, and that's for overhead, right? And so generally the guidelines around that are sort of, in the 20% range or lower. And that's what I think is interesting, because when I've talked to artists about how they think about their fee in relationship to their project, the numbers they've given me are similar. Because for an individual artist that's doing the project, I think of the fee is going to them to support their life and their work. In an organization, everybody is paid, and then there's this overhead to keep the lights on and to keep the organization, like its day-to-day operations going. And that's the tendency of the allocation. Although, like, I pause here because I actually think the allocation that would be more widely discussed 20 years ago was 25%. And what I hear now is 15%. And there's no clear reason why. Like, I can't actually explain it. And I think that it's not helping us because administrative costs in nonprofit organizations are quite substantial, and they're important. But Sarah, if that's useful, that's the range that I've been seeing, and that has come up. And I think in this example here, there isn't an allocation under administrative. It's really a category of like line item expenses that are all very specific and are hard costs. But hopefully that's useful, because I'm sure that some people here also run organizations.
Thank you, Kay. Jean, did you have a question? I thought I saw a hand up.
Oh, yeah, no, it was just when Kay was talking about the number, should it be 20%? Like on the philanthropy side, like for example, the Ford Foundation recently made it a 20%, so 20% of your expenses would be your indirect costs. And they're actually looking to increase that now to 25%. So 25% of your indirect costs. So if it's $100,000, it's not 25,000. It's a different kind of math because you're doing it of the expenses. But like, I feel like that's a reasonable rule of thumb, and that some of the things that Kay's talking about, it's just like, how do you explain it to somebody who just doesn't know, right? Because the reality for a lot of artists is that you do have these expenses and they're totally legitimate, and just being able to have the language to explain, like, well, this is how I came about with this number, or this is a standard number, or this is a reasonable number, like that feels like the important thing that artists need to be able to have.
Yes. And sort of budgeting from across a range of projects and seeing how do the administrative costs, for example, add up and support the costs over the course of a year. I'm going to move on quickly and flash this next slide, which is, are people able to see this? Is it too small, or can you actually see the numbers, or does it just?
I'm able to see it if I expand my screen, but can others see it? Do you want to zoom in? Would that help people? You prefer zoom in? Okay, yeah, a little.
When I do that, does that make it bigger? Did I actually just make it bigger, or no? It's the same size for you.
It looks the same size.
Yeah, it's because I'm sharing screen. It's not. Oh, I would have to zoom in from, I think, preview. Let's see. How's that? Yeah. Is that better? Okay. This is a co-production budget, and just again, like, disclaimer, I was given permission to use this by one performing arts presenter, and it's an example of one relationship they have with an artist. So of course, everyone's relationships and budgets and structures and levels are different. But I think it's useful to point to in that sort of relationship where this is often just not visible, right, to artists, that an institution that's working with an artist will be raising money from, they have columns here, grant 1 to presenter for artist project, grant 2 to presenter for artist project, and grant 3. I mean, they would just have funder names in the actual organization, of course, but they have a column for each of those grants, right? How they're planning to spend the money that they're planning to raise from these funders to put towards a project they're in co-production with an artist on. And then when you look under the expense section, under artistic fees, there's commission fees to lead artists and performance fees to lead artists. And those are the 2 items that map back to the artist's budget for the project, right? And then it reflects, of course, the different things, the different expenses that the venue is, the presenter will be planning to cover, both on its own side, its own staff, its internal expenses, et cetera, and how they're planning to cover those costs. And then if you scroll down, there's this sub-budget, which they provided as an illustration of, like, this is what they got from the artist, to understand what the artist's costs were, and the total costs that artist had conveyed was $43,000, and that the development and commissioning phase of it would be $25,000, and the performance phase would be $18,500. And that's where you see here under the artistic fees, those 2 phases of work are in that presenter's budget. So, having a budget that reflects your own costs, and then it enables you to be in conversation with your partners about what your expenses are, and having done that work will help you plan together and negotiate together to make sure that that project can happen. I will say that one of the I don't want to toot my own horn. I just want to say that budget education is important. I got feedback from a presenter once that the artists that they were able to actually have very productive conversations and planning on the financial side of their projects were ones who had taken the financial training course that LMCC had offered. And I thought that was really the highest praise that one could expect, is that it would actually, say that this work was really benefiting artists, so that they could be true partners and have those conversations that are really necessary with their presenting partners. So I don't know if anyone has any questions here. Of course, I'm not able to really represent the presenter side of things, but I thought it's this is a good example of kind of seeing how those pieces all add up together in planning on a project. And I don't know if anyone has their own experiences too that they want to share around this kind of work. Michael, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so speaking as a presenter, I'm also, as a lot of people in the room know, I'm also an occasionally touring artist. So I'm, along a broader spectrum than some. But as a presenter, I often have artists or artist reps who really don't want to get involved, because I'm more of those who know me well, I tend to share a lot in terms of process, in terms of agency, in terms of, really trying to democratize things, when, not all the time, but when I can. Mm-hmm. I have had these interesting moments where, from the artist side, where their basically reaction was like, why are you telling me? Like, I don't want to know, like, it's not my problem. And I'm to their credit, in standard terms, relations in both profit and nonprofit fields, they're right. But that's what I'm trying to break down, and I'm just curious if you have any brief thoughts about, experiences that you've had to try and get through that kind of moment.
I think there's on the one hand, yes, you're right. And then on the other hand, I think the question around that is the question of why, right? Is like, and also that it seems like it doesn't feel like that kind of, it feels like that information may feel burdensome to that person, or is like too much for them, especially if they're not already kind of thinking about their own work and able to speak about their own sort of financial circumstance. And I think that's very much kind of an example of this let's say, a possible future that I think is better. It's like if artists can speak to their own financial needs and plans, and they're better positioned to really plan forward with an institution. And I think there's also a lot of, in the same way there's a lot of emotion around personal finances, there's just a lot of emotion around money. And what comes attached to that is both these ideas that maybe you're not good enough, or you don't know, or somebody else is trying to take something from you. There's so many emotions that have come up in finance programs. And so it is really difficult space. So no judgment at all, because I think there's also power dynamics that, artists feel with any presenting institution. And so they may feel on the back foot about having the ability to have those conversations. And so, yeah, I mean, it feels like one of those, like, oh, don't bring those problems towards me. I already have, enough of my own. But I think really it is like the more that artists speak in groups, and maybe I'm going to go on a tangent, but I once had a conversation with a wonderful choreographer who's been in the field for a long time about the finance program. And she said, I don't need a class. Like, I don't want to waste my time in a room listening to everybody else's problems. Like, I have very specific questions and needs in terms of how to work on my finances. And they include this, and this. And there were all things that were comprehensively covered in the finance program, right? So there's also a feeling a lot of times where people feel that their financial challenges are personal and specific to them. And sometimes that feels also pathologizing, like there's something wrong with you because you have these kinds of challenges. But actually, everybody has those challenges, including the presenting institutions that are really, working with artists. And so the more that as people sort of talk about this in groups, it becomes apparent. It's a reason that I'm a big fan of sort of group workshops around finance, because you learn so much from each other. And there can be a tendency in fields too to become more and more narrow. Like, I need to know more and more and more. Things should be about my discipline specifically, and they should be more specific to me. But the more that you hear from other people, the more that you can see that the problems are shared, the problems are similar, but sometimes the solutions are different, and the things that people are doing in different fields are useful to hear, and might be applicable or might be helpful in coming up with next steps in your own practice or in your own work.
Thank you.
But thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, it's very much that the challenge of fundraising and resources it's real for artists, and it's real for presenters. So everyone is in that same boat, but it can feel like the artist is in a more vulnerable place for sure. I want to be mindful of time, so I think I'm going to move us on to the next to some tax section here. I think I'm going to zoom out so it's not so gigantic. Oh, I'm in the wrong. Sorry. Okay. Taxes. You get a lot of questions about taxes. I'm not a tax preparer. I'm not a certified financial planner or a CPA. That's my disclaimer. I'm not giving tax advice. But there are a few like broad reaching items I think are useful to talk about in terms of tax issues that we see arising for artists a lot. The first one being grants to individuals, of course, can be taxed. And large, if you receive a large fellowship or if you receive the Doris Duke Award, how is it going to affect your financial life? And I think that it still happens that people are not prepared for the tax implication, and they're not prepared to think about when that money will come into their life and when in relationship to the things that they're doing. And so if you're in a position to receive a large lump sum of any kind from a grant making organization, I think it's always important to, and a lot of fellowship funders are already aware of this, but that you're thinking about the timing of when you're going to be receiving payments in relationship to what is going on in your financial year, and thinking about whether or not you'll be incurring professional expenses that will help offset this large influx into your income. And that's why we, for example, we don't like to pay our fellowship grants. We pay them in January. We don't pay them in December. We don't want you to have that income showing up at the end of the year and you had no way of sort of thinking about how that relates to your expenses and your other income over time. The other thing that we've seen a fair amount is that it also can affect if artists have access or are accessing certain kinds of benefits that have asset caps or income caps, that a sudden influx in a given year can create problems there. And so this is just to encourage you all, if you receive such awards and grants, to think about the timing and be in conversation with any sort of grant maker about it, and with your accountant about it early enough so that you don't end up losing some portion of that to taxes, or if it leads you to lose access to certain benefits that are really important. I also like to talk briefly about getting audited, because I think this is a pain point for some people where they're very nervous about getting audited with the IRS or getting caught in some circumstance. And then other people sort of bury their head in the sand and don't sort of want to deal with their taxes at all. So of course, it's good to hit the middle ground. If you're running behind, there's no shame in your game. Just try to get your taxes in. But if you're really worried about getting audited, there are just a couple of things to keep in mind, because it isn't untrue that sometimes artists are targeted for auditing. And that's because they often have a lot of deductions, right? And so it's true, of course, everybody says keep your receipts, and there are different ways that you can keep receipts now, since a lot of them seem to fade in like 6 months' time if they're printed. So receipts, of course, are important, but there are a couple of other things to keep in mind. Is if you're keeping a calendar of your professional activities as an artist, this is really important. And you probably have to do it anyway, because you're all very busy people and you need to keep track of your appointments. But the time you spent in this with me in this hour and a half on finance is professional development, and is time you're investing in your practice to make money. And that's the kind of thing that comes up in an audit. One of the big questions at the very beginning that people try to establish in an audit is whether or not the person is engaged in the activity for profit. And that's especially if you have a lot of if you're not making a profit from a tax perspective, but you may be trying to do so, and you may be very active in the field professionally. You actually have engagements, and you have meetings and appointments, and you're doing these kinds of activities. It's useful to have a record of that. There's something called the hobby loss rule in taxes, and that's where when people say you're not making money, so is this a hobby? And if the IRS determines that what you're doing is not a professional activity to make profit, that sort of is a really difficult outcome from an auditing perspective. So the thing to be mindful of is just that you're keeping records that will demonstrate that you're a professional artist, and that you're working in the field, and you're doing things, and you're making efforts to generate a profit. So that's just important to keep in mind. And those are important things, as much as sort of the receipts that people focus on are very much about whether or not you can back up the deductions or the expenses that you have. Always important. But that bigger picture context about positioning your professional work as an artist is very important too. And then I think sort of a good segue from this, that sort of when people sometimes people decide that they want to focus on their taxes, so they'll take a workshop on their taxes. And I always think that the benefit of sort of more comprehensive personal financial training is that it helps you connect the dots over sort of a lifetime, that there are things that you may be prioritizing now that 3 years from now you'll have a different priority, and that will be and what you've been doing with your taxes will be important for reaching that priority. One of those tends to be home ownership. So a lot of artists spend, they're thinking year to year around taxes and thinking about it as, a potential tax bill, and not wanting to have to have surprise tax payment that's due because of XYZ issue, or, so people are focusing on sort of minimizing the tax burden year to year. And that's not a bad thing to do. But if you are hoping to own a home and access a mortgage sometime in the next 3 years, it's a good time to then start thinking about really what's the relationship of your taxes in how they show your and demonstrate your income, right, in relationship to your goal down the road of accessing a loan for your home, for a home, and being able to do that, because it's already complex for artists who don't have a regular paycheck to show and meet certain kinds of mortgage lender requirements. And also if you're sort of minimizing, if you're really focused on what the sort of tax bill is on your stated income, remember that your stated income year to year is information that's needed for other things, for example, to access loans for a mortgage. So it's always good to start thinking about how taxes and how your income ties into something like a long-term goal, like homeownership and mortgage access. Just start thinking about it a few years before you think you'll be ready to purchase a home. And I know for actually a lot of artists, buying a home became they sort of worked on their readiness. And then a few years out, were able to move forward on that. So just, again, keeping track of sort of the relationship of certain practices you may be engaged in now and what you might need or want to shift if you have different goals for the future. Any other kind of big picture questions or observations about taxes that anyone wants to share or talk about? I'm going to talk very quickly about credit and debt. I think people are aware that art schools are among the most expensive in the country. And so, of course, there's a challenge where a lot of artists enter the field already with a lot of debt from their training and their education. I'm not an expert in debt management, and I always defer people to like appropriate credit counseling services around that if people are actually experiencing really difficult circumstance around loans and debts, because those appropriate credit agencies, not the scammers, that can offer actually, like Green Path Debt Solutions is one, can really do free counseling and dig in with people on the important things and what to do. But in terms of talking about sort of debt and working capital, there is a kind of, there's a need, I think, for a lot of artists have for working capital that enables them to pay for things while they're waiting for grants to come in or other kinds of resources or payments to come in. That's another area where budgeting can help you sort of determine like what is the amount of money, like what kind of a working cushion would be really helpful and take a lot of stress away if you're able to have that cushion to sort of bridge cash flow challenges that come in on a project or, in your working life. These are both, for personal reasons or for project related reasons. A lot of times this is where sort of credit card can be used as a bridge. And some people do that really well. But credit card, of course, interest rates can continue to be really quite insane. There've been some reforms around what credit card companies can do, and that's been good for consumers. But I think it's still worth thinking about building up cash cushions and how to do that over time so that credit cards don't become that same that critical resource. I know there are different organizations that are looking at ways to make sort of revolving loans more available to artists, but I think that no interest cushions are always really, really valuable. I think also in talking about credit and debt, there's also a kind of phenomenon that people have referred to, and I'm sort of curious if people, what people think about it, or if they know of artists where this happens, where there's a really big professional opportunity that someone has, is a really big step up in terms of audience or venue and circumstance, and that kind of opportunity can lead to substantial debt. Like there's a sort of a pressure to rise to the occasion that also becomes financial and can actually put people into a really difficult place. It's sort of one of the people that I have worked with who does a lot of credit education sort of says, you know, it's that moment when you sort of close your eyes and you put your credit card out and you say, like, okay, I'm just going to do this because it's so important. That there's a kind of a pressure that exists in the field with some of these opportunities that can be a really sticking point for artists around debt. I spoke a little bit about homeownership in relationship to taxes. I like to always put home ownership, pepper that throughout any of my financial talks, I think, because, of course, because I'm based in New York City, and homeownership has been a really great strategy for a lot of artists to be able to stay put in New York City, especially as rents most recently have become so insane. And, you know, there are a lot of actually good first-time homeowner programs that can help people qualify for lower mortgages. We're in a very complex credit environment right now, so which I'm not going to comment on, because only to say that, of course, the interest rates right now are higher than they've ever been, because of the Fed's decisions to try to, you know, keep the economy in a positive, moving in a positive direction. So how that's influencing mortgages, I'm not going to opine about or suggest that this is a good time to get a mortgage, because interest rates are really, really changing. But again, homeownership, I think, is always a sort of multi-year planning process. And I just like to say here that if that's something that you think is in your future, that it's useful to start thinking about your credit score and credit rating, and thinking about accessing a really good first-time homeownership program. There are many in New York City, actually, that can then help you get everything in order and not feel like you're out on your own planning for these things. And I always like to just call out Esther Robinson here, who is just an extraordinary individual who has worked so to develop an extraordinary artist homeownership program. She runs a studio facility in around Sunset Park, Industry City, called Art Built. And I always encourage people to tap into her work and her advice, because she's really been such a great advocate for artists on this front. And then quickly, just a couple of comments here about savings, investment, and retirement. In talking about investment, like investing in the stock market and retirement funds, etc., I've talked with a lot of artists who didn't want to deal with it, in part because of the ethics of Wall Street. And a lot of people who have said that they'd rather sort of invest in real estate, like buy a home or something that will appreciate in value over time. And I try to be, in sort of giving these talks, I try to be values agnostic about that. If you don't want to engage in the possible perils of the stock market, that is absolutely your choice, and not here to advocate for one or the other thing. But of course, Many people invest in the stock market, in retirement funds, in equities, and related investments over time. And I think if you're planning on making investments, if you're thinking about putting money towards retirement, the risk tolerance and ethics piece is just an important thing to spend some time thinking about. And whether or not you have, some people have also said, like, I'm looking for an alternative to that, in other ways that my money can grow or other things that I can do. And there's kind of like community lending. There are actually like lending communities that people get involved in, where they can lend, they put their money in and they're lending money to other people who are then paying it back with interest. And that's how they're growing their money. And it's a sort of in a straightforward and clear community lending circumstance. So those things are available too. And it's worth taking a little time to look around and think about how you can have any savings that you have grow passively, right? So it would earn interest, or it would be gaining in value if it's invested in stocks over time. And because the value of time, in terms of having that money grow, is so important. I had a conversation with Donna Uchizono years ago, and so I always like to cite this too, because someone had brought to my attention that she had talked to her dancers about the importance of creating a retirement fund early, because it makes such a difference, because that money grows over time and you can sort of forget about it. And then years later feel like, wow, like something happened without my doing it, right? That money grew. And she would always encourage her dancers to create retirement funds. And she had certain dancers that would say, okay, well, Donna, then the money I make working with you, I will put into my retirement fund, and that will be my retirement fund. Which I think was just really a wonderful mentorship and extraordinary thing to do. I've also worked with artists in programs who, in the middle of the program, said, oh, so now that I'm taking this class, I decide to open this mail that I get that I usually just throw away because I don't know what it is. And I opened it up, and I actually have started a retirement fund at a job that I had for like 2 years, 10 years ago, and forgot about, and didn't know what this mail was and didn't know how to read it. And I have 10,000, like I have like 10 or $15,000 in there that I didn't know was there. And so that's why I say it's important to open your mail, because there may be things in your past. You may have done something good a long time ago. I've had more than one person say that to me. So I feel that means that there's a fair number of people who are not opening their financial mail, A, and B, who are just not remembering that they did the right thing a long time ago and may put part of their paycheck away into something that's been quietly growing over time. But I also like to illustrate like the comment of pay yourself first, and how that a lot of people like to say pay yourself first. What does that mean? And that typically, one way to interpret that is, when you have income coming in, put some of it into your savings right away. In essence, you're paying yourself first before you pay your bills, et cetera, or automate savings so that you don't have to make the decision like, oh, I'm going to put this away, because sometimes that can be a torturous endeavor. And if you have to decide for yourself, how am I going to use my money every month? Am I going to put any money away for savings? It's sometimes harder to do that. But automating a certain amount towards savings every month, putting money into savings before anything else, is a way of thinking about paying yourself first, and a way of slowly building up some resources for yourself over time. Does anyone have any observations, or is anybody enthusiastically saving for retirement? Or unenthusiastically saving for retirement?
Bonnie, did you have a question?
It wasn't a question so much as, as you're talking, first of all, Kay, this has really been wonderful. Thank you so much. I also serve on the Western Council of the Entertainment Community Fund, and I don't know how many of you are impacted by the strikes that are going on and the length of time. So I just wanted to take this moment to remind all of you that there are ways to help out before things go so far down you can't dig yourself out of the hole. Just think about that. There are emergency funds that we can help with rent, food. And so just keep that in mind. It's open to any professional, and we have satellite offices in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing it. I recognize that there are a lot of, there may be questions that people would like to share and discuss, and we don't have a lot of time left. I know that some of the other things I wanted to talk about are sticking points that come up financially, and also some examples of changes that I've seen artists make and decisions I've seen artists make that really made a big positive shift in their financial situation over time. And I'm happy to go ahead and share those things, but maybe I should pause because I think that people might have come to this workshop with a lot of questions that they wanted to air here.
Kay, there is a question in the chat that had some likes, so I think it resonates with more than one person. But someone was asking, I'd be curious about how to avoid living in a scarcity mindset when my income comes in spurts and isn't regular. Months I make money, I can't spend because I need to save. Months I don't make money, I can't spend money because I'm not making money. So they're wondering if you could speak to that, how to avoid living in a scarcity mindset.
I think well, there are a couple of things, because I feel like that challenge is one that often just stops people from budgeting because they can't predict. And so there's a kind of like a year that needs to just be about information gathering without judgment. So there's that piece of like, if that's what's happening, to actually record it so that at some point you can look back on your year and start to see if there's any patterns, or if there are, how much of a sort of emergency fund or cushion would be helpful to see you through periods of time, to be able to set a goal to say, oh, if I were able to bring this much more income into my life, this would change my day-to-day. Or if I could have this much more in my bank account as a cash cushion, this could affect. So those are like concrete things that are not that have a real impact on your ability to sort of weather these ups and downs, because I think that's at sort of the core of being able to, in a concrete way, create a little more stability. But until you're, but what that needs is information gathering, and then thinking about ways to raise the funds that would allow that to happen, or save the funds that would allow that to happen. And in the meantime, there's just a lot of precarity and a lot of difficult decision making. I've also worked with artists who were managing their income in a certain scale because they were accessing really important benefits, health related and other kinds of benefits that they were actually relying on, that would give them a little stability. And so then they were very careful to make sure that they kind of stayed within those bounds to be able to continue to access those benefits. What ended up happening for that artist, and I think is another sort of is a sticking point, is this kind of challenge where there's a realization that the income is too low, and you've sort of managed everything that you can to keep everything as doable as possible, but sort of like there's only so much expense you can reduce, right? And then people are in a place where, oh, there's not enough income, and that's actually something has to be done there, and it's about finding another income stream, and that may be necessary to build up also sort of the cash cushion to weather these other times, but in general to create more stability over time. And in the case of that one artist who had been accessing very specifically benefits that were really helping him keep his life going and feeling stable, decided that he was going to pursue different kinds of employment and circumstances because he wanted his life to be bigger, and he was managing his life. He felt that he was in this scarcity mentality of keeping his life very small, because he was very afraid of what would happen otherwise. He's now he moved to another city, became a full-time professor, not a full-time professor, but got a professorship at a university that really helped him financially, continued his practice, and he recently moved back to New York City and has a teaching position in New York City, where he always sort of really sees himself over time. He had been in New York, he moved to another city, and now he's back in New York City. I think another example, I have an artist, I worked with an artist who was teaching like adjunct teaching in person, and it was very draining on her time, and it didn't pay very much. And she really spent some time kind of thinking that she needed to change the income that she was making. And what she did was devise a virtual class. This was before the pandemic. But she devised a virtual class and ended up teaching 2 virtual classes that were much easier for her to do, but actually paid her more. And with the additional income that she was able to generate there, she actually rented her studio, she was a visual artist. She rented a studio space for the first time. And because she had a studio space, she was able to invite people to her studio and started selling her work for the first time. These are just 2 examples. But I think sort of going back to there's that kind of nuts and bolts first steps of when income is so unpredictable. Sometimes you have to spend some time information gathering during that process so that you can set some goals for how to actually address them in a concrete way. I hope that's useful. I don't know if anyone has an experience of sort of working through a period of time or setting a financial goal that helped them address those kinds of questions. I'm just sort of reading in the, I've been speaking, so I haven't been really looking at the chat.
There's another one in the chat, Kate. Someone asked, what are the most important things artists can do now to plan for retirement? And I know that you just spoke about that topic, but if there's anything else you wanted to share on the topic of retirement.
It is just start putting money away for retirement as soon as you possibly can. It's more important to do something than to do nothing. I think the challenge around retirement is that people get very, there's so much information and there's so many funds and it feels complex, but there are actually retirement funds that are like target year 2045, like whenever you would be at a retirement age. And it manages itself. It changes its, if you've paid attention to retirement funds, like the composition of your investments will change over time based on how close you are to retirement to become more conservative over time. And that can be sort of built into certain kinds of target funds. And I think that, not falling into a hole of feeling like you have to find the perfect retirement vehicle is important, and maybe asking around and like I hesitate to name certain kind of retirement funds here, but I think that there are very common ones that are very well regarded. And as we start to see the economy improve, and we don't know if we're going to have a recession or not, and this conversation is still ongoing, the market is improving and has been steadily improving this year significantly over what happened last year. So that's maybe something to keep in mind, that there are funds you can invest in where you don't have to spend an enormous amount of time managing what's going on there, and that may be easier for artists. I think the one thing also I should say around the budgeting piece is, and gathering information is actually, if you keep a spending diary for a month, then you'll know what your nut is. It's like, just write down everything you spend. It feels tiresome. There's software that helps you do it. But when you do that, then you also come up with that number, like, oh, this is how much my expenses are. And that helps you also to develop the budget, right? So there are going to be monthly costs that you have that are bills, but you also will need to know, like, how much spending cash do I actually need every week? And how does that translate into a monthly budget? And so that, like, knowing how much you need is always a great starting point. And then the question about the income streams, you may need to track over a longer time. All right. It's 4:29. Does anyone have 5 minutes to hear some more stories about positive changes people have made?
Yeah.
I recognize if some people really need to leave, I have a hard stop. I just really want to thank you for being here and listening. And this is the kind of conversation I could have all day long, but I know that you don't have all day. So thank you very much. And for those of you who are able to stay, I think there are a couple of things. Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of sticking points and then how some people addressed certain sticking points. But I think sticking points are useful because, again, they kind of they show commonality. So I've talked about the challenge of paying yourself and being sure to pay yourself, and the challenges of not paying yourself, and the challenges of pricing your work. And I think a lot of people are already aware of this, but one of the challenges also around payment and paying others is, of course, that particularly in the performing arts, people find themselves in the position of being an employer and not being aware of it, or not wanting to sort of, there are a lot of responsibilities that come up with, being categorized as an employer, and expenses and time that are associated with it. And I think it's just really important to talk to other people in the field around their experiences of that and how you can be prepared, so you don't end up on the wrong side of sort of a workers' comp tax requirement or other kinds of fines and fees, because your dancers have been are considered employees. I think being educated around that and having resources and people to talk to about it, I think, are incredibly important, because, again, those are the kinds of things that can come up and just really reach a crisis. Dana, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is just sort of a really quick question, but it sort of has to do with the field that I've been wondering about. Of course, there's so many grants that are about capital campaigns for bricks and mortar, right? That foundations go for, et cetera. But is there a trend at all for human capital campaigns? So, for example, that would help our dance company give more every month to our dancers' 401ks that we offer them, or would help us with their health insurance benefits, right? Because one thing that's very expensive for us is the health insurance that we offer. And which is kind of unusual for a dance company too, I think. But is there any trend or any place that's interested in supporting those sort of things that actually support the core mission of the company to support those dancers,
That is such a good question. It's a wonderful idea. I'm not personally aware of it, but I also feel like, our field has been, people are really looking for solutions and looking for change in our field over the last several years in particular. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were, and I'm simply just not aware of them. I don't know if anyone else in this space is aware of those things, but I also think if you have a donor base, and you're not planning on building a building, it's so important, and it's so in the background. Generally, the support that is necessary to pay people appropriately, and it's such an important conversation that's happening field wide right now that I would encourage you to keep pursuing those conversations. I know we have some funders in the room. I think, maybe Emiko has left the room, but I'm a lot of there are funders right now that are paying more attention to. There's a real openness to finding ways to pay. Oh, Emiko, are you here? Do you want to comment? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Hi, Dana. Great question.
Hi. Thank you.
The funders you do have, I think, there's a lot of, I think, attention being paid to safety nets for artists in particular. And I know some organizations that have really actually approached funders to great success, talking about exactly wanting to provide this kind of foundational support underneath artists. I think also So I would just encourage you to have the conversation and potentially test it out as a fundraising theme. To I don't know of anything about it in particular, but like a funder in particular or funding area.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I think we're kind of at that place, and also listening to this conversation, we've just been having a bunch of conversations about how can we, get more support around those two areas specifically. So this was really helpful. I think we'll keep trying and be more vocal. Yeah.
I think so. This
you.
is a time for sure where conversations about compensation across the board are much more front and center. So I think it's the right time to have those conversations. And thank you, Emiko. That was great. I appreciate your chiming in. I think there are maybe two other points that I wanted to make around, well, no, I'm going to move to positive changes. I'm going to talk about having goals. Part of this is also because, so one of these, a couple of examples I share are changes in mindset. And this one is an example, people grow up with a money mindset that comes from their families. And that can be really difficult to change. And we worked with an artist whose first question in class was, as an artist, they were as a person in their family, they were going up being told it's better not to have money, because if you have money, everybody's going to ask you for it. And she was like, what do I do? What do you do if you grow up with that mindset? And we said, that's a really good question. We can't, we're here to talk about, maybe at the end of this process is going to do something that would be useful. But of course, we didn't feel like we could change the mindset in that moment. But I think really one of the things that was, and she had an experience actually of coming into some money, and then like her family members all coming and asking her for it. So she really was like living that experience, and feeling like she was not supposed to like want to have money because of it. And she was also very unhappy with her a job that she had, and she really ultimately, of course, wanted to spend all of her time making her work and making money off of her work, and didn't know how to get there. At the end of 6 weeks, she was very clear on her goals for the next year and a half, where she said, well, I've decided that this job that I have that I don't like, I took it for a reason, and it's actually supporting, she's a photographer, and she was working in a business that actually supported the production of her own work, that she could actually do some of her work there, and that she decided she would stay in that job for another 6 months so she could complete a certain body of work that she had been planning on completing. And then at that point, she was going to try to find a different kind of day job resource for herself. And we've talked to a lot of artists that have decided to really just come out of the program and said, oh, the day job I have isn't really serving me. It takes too much energy, or it doesn't pay enough, or both. A couple of other strategies that were sort of more specific things that artists had shared with us. One of them I've always thought is so fascinating, and so I have to just share it because I'm not sure how it works. And I also want to recognize that I'm just going to share it here. Working one project ahead. This was a theater company that was fundraising they would sort of develop a project and know what it was, and then fundraise for it. And so there was a little bit, and this is where I just want to be clear that there's, they were sort of getting around the challenge of talking about a project that you haven't made, and trying to raise money for it. And they were actually raising money for something they already knew what it was. And so they could feel confident about how much it cost. And they basically put in the time. They were always one project ahead. So when they sort of raised money, and I really say this sort of values agnostically, because I don't know how they were raising the money for their work, and it could be primarily individual donors, but they were really using the money. They were using it for their next project, if that makes sense. How does that work? I don't know the mechanics of it, but I thought it was very interesting because it really helped keep them on an even planning keel. I also was very fortunate to serve on the board of Trudgell Harrell's company for a period of time. And as some of you may be familiar with, 20 Elixir of Paris is Burning, his multi-year project that has multiple scales, and where he works in that body of work that are small, medium, large, extra small, which actually kind of it aligns with the, small was a solo, extra small was a lecture with a video work. Extra large was actually opera house level production, but all under the same sort of artistic questions and concepts. So the work was kind of a series and very thematically related. Having this sort of it actually gave him the ability to talk to presenters about these core ideas that he's interested in, the work that he's interested in. And presenters would have varying budgets and capacity. It increases touring in an incredible way because a different version, a different piece, like the small or the medium or the large, could go to a different venue. And it just having an incredible impact on the exposure of the exposure he had to audiences nationally and internationally. And that's, I think it's just a really wonderful example of something where the conceptual and artistic goals also align in such a really interesting and positive way with the finances of it all. It just, the way that he was working gave him so much flexibility and the ability to respond to opportunities in a lot of different ways. Beyond sort of the idea of like one project of one scale that happens several times. So I always like to just comment on that. I thought it was just such a wonderful confluence of positive things. I love that body of work. And then another example of an artist who had a crisis around Hurricane Sandy and lost everything in his studio, and then was applying for relief grants to recover. And he asked for relief grants, but he didn't ask for them to replace everything that he had in his studio. He got several grants and he decided, well, he could replace everything in his studio and sort of keep going along the lines that he was going on. But he decided instead to invest in learning techniques and approaches in video and technology that he had wanted to do, but didn't have the resource to do. So that kind of what was a crisis, he sort of shifted into an opportunity to shift his practice towards things he had been interested in for a long time and hadn't really sort of found the way to move forward in, which I just really admired as an example of someone who was turning something that could be really turned a terrible circumstance into a chance to sort of reinvent the practice in a way that he was really excited about. Yeah. So those are a couple of examples. I think the last thing I'll say is this is a benefit of financial education of someone who came in to the program who was unemployed at the time, a visual artist, took the class because it was free and just thought, well, I better do it. And then got in by lottery and thought and shrugged and said, why not? During the 6-week program, she organized all of her finances and those of her mother, who's also an artist. She had difficult conversations with her mother about her estate and actually developed an estate plan with her mother. So they both felt more confident about that things would be taken care of. She started investing her money in the stock market in a very modest way, but that created a lot of excitement for her. And a side benefit that she shared was that she found speaking at cocktail parties and events was so much more fun because she could talk to more people because she wasn't afraid of the stock market. So this is just like a humorous ending. The other thing she said is substantially getting over her money fears. She also got a new teaching job that she loved. And then she met the love of her life. And she felt that letting go of the fear that she had been carrying around by not dealing with her finances really led her to the love of her life. I don't think we could ever really take any kind of credit for that, but it's a beautiful story, and just another example of how a space can open up for a lot of things, if you can get rid of some of the fear and anxiety that financial woes can bring. So I thank you. I thank you for staying longer. And I wish we could all have sort of more generative conversation about this, because I'm always interested in what artists are thinking about in changing financial systems and improving their lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kay. That was incredible. And I'm so glad that we recorded this so it lives on. So for folks watching this after August 12th, we're happy that you're here. But thank you so much, Kay. I love all the different sections of how you broke down an artist's life and their financial life. So I appreciate it. And Phil, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to thank folks for coming again. If you aren't a member yet, please join. I just sent an email out to everybody with information on that. Our next event is on Saturday, September 9th. It's a community tea house. So it's, again, one of these chances for us to just be in a room full of other AAPI creatives and just hear about what other folks are working on. Give a chance for you to share what you're working on. So it's a chance to meet new people, potential collaborators, new friends, just other artists who are working in this field, because I think one of the big things we came out of this process was we feel siloed, we feel invisible, we feel alone. And so this community tea house is a way for us to see each other, learn about each other's artistic practices, and just build a more meaningful sense of community. So I hope to see all of you there September 9th. It's a free community event for us. Also, thank you again to our Gold Standard board members for tuning in and all of your support. And yeah, have a great weekend, folks. Thank you. Thank you again to Kay and Sarah. Great session. I'm really excited to watch this one again.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.